Comrades, this meeting tonight shows the wide variety of struggles that our party is deeply involved in and interested in. It's not unlike a time 50 years ago that I'm going to be talking about a little bit. Let me say that when I was asked to speak on the Kennedy assassination, because today is the actual anniversary, I felt that almost everyone would have heard my talk to the conference. And that while, you know, I would like to make some of the general points over again and maybe say a couple of new things, I don't want to give a big, long talk on that. And I asked if I could also talk about the Boeing situation and the situation of workers at Boeing, because I think it's very important. It's on the front page of our paper this week, but you probably have not seen much about it at all in the bourgeois media. But you're going to hear some of things about it tonight that I think will interest you very much. So, you know, we're at the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, 50 years in which there's been many, many books and articles written that showed that Lee Harvey Oswald could not have been the lone assassination, as the Warren Commission, which was set up after the assassination, claimed. And some of these books go into very meticulous detail about the gun, the number of bullets, the timing of the shots, what angle they came from. There are a lot of things that you could find in these books that show that what the Warren Commission was saying really wasn't possible. I'm not going to go into all of that, but I think it's very interesting that in a recent poll that was taken of people in this country, most of whom I would think, since it was 50 years ago, most of whom, you know, have been born since the Kennedy assassination took place. They're younger people. But 61% do not believe the premise of the Warren Commission report. They think that there was a conspiracy, even though there's been 50 years of efforts by the government and the capitalist media to convince them otherwise. The question, though, is, what do they think? Do they think that this conspiracy was a right-wing conspiracy, or do they think it was a left-wing conspiracy, which, of course, is what the right wing would want them to think, and maybe a lot of people who are pro-bourgeois in the middle would also want them to think too, if they're going to think it's a conspiracy at all. Well, let's just go over a couple of things. We thought at the time that it was very clear, within hours of the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald, that the intention of this assassination was to blame the left. Right. They had big photos of him out right away. He was holding guns. He was holding up the Militant, the paper of the SWP, and other pro-Cuba literature appeared. And it was immediately revealed that this guy, who they said had killed Kennedy, had lived and worked in the Soviet Union for a while. But then he was assassinated 2 days later. So you never could get to hear his side of the story because there was never any trial. So if you believed that Oswald did it, then you couldn't believe it was a conspiracy. Let me explain why. Because would the USSR or Cuba, even assuming, and this is, I don't believe this at all, but assuming they would want Kennedy dead, would they send someone to assassinate him who was so clearly identified with them? He had been in the USSR. He was photographed passing out pro-Cuba literature. I mean, it's ludicrous. Anybody would know. No government that wanted to carry out an assassination would do it that way. You could have brought on a nuclear confrontation. Like the missile crisis. That was the last thing that either Cuba or the Soviet Union wanted. So, if you really believe it was a conspiracy, by necessity, that points you in the direction of saying that the ultra-right was behind it. That's who had the motive to do it. That's who would want it to be blamed on a leftist, assuming he was a real leftist. And that would have given them the opportunity to make a grab for power. Now, that was the view of our party leader, Comrade Sam Marcy, that was expressed in 3 very important articles in our paper in the first month after the assassination. And I'm really, really sorry that in those days when we were doing so many things, we didn't make a pamphlet out of those articles, because they're not easy to get now, because they weren't digitized at the time. Those papers are old. You'd have to go back to microfilm or to some kind of a recently digitized copy, and I hope we can do that someday. But he called this an attempted coup by the ultra-right, but one that did not succeed in them taking power, taking over. One thing you should know is that when the assassination happened, the Kennedy forces were initially, they seemed paralyzed. For example, Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, he was the Attorney General at the time. He was responsible for leading an investigation and finding who it was that had killed his brother. But he almost disappeared. He played no role in what followed. I want to describe the political atmosphere at the time of the assassination. At the conference, I spoke about the many setbacks for imperialism that had preceded 1963. There were many liberation struggles going on. There was the Cuban Revolution. There was the civil rights movement in this country, which was growing, and there was the rise of the Black Power movement. There was the U.S. failure to have a victory for its mercenaries at the Bay of Pigs. So there was a mood of desperation that was being expressed in the far right. And there was the rise of fascist organizations, which, as I explained, we were very instrumental in fighting against them. The Nazi Party, the Klan, they were all very active at that time. The struggle here in the United States was becoming more intense. Now, just to give you a very immediate example for that period, we led a demonstration in New York City, and I didn't get to mention this in my talk. It went through the West Side. It was protesting the police shooting of 2 Puerto Rican workers in the back of a squad car. They shot and killed these 2 workers. We called a demonstration at the precinct where these police came from. We marched right on that side. On the other side of the street was a big project, I think it's still there, 100th Street on the west side. People began to gather. People were hanging out the windows. The crowd kept getting bigger and bigger. Some of the Latinos on the demonstration with us began saying to the crowd on the other side of the street, "Únense, come and join us, come and join us." Then came this incredible moment when we stepped into the street and they stepped into the street from the other side. Hundreds of people. And we were embracing one another. They were lifting us up on their shoulders. They were climbing up on top of the police cars and giving talks about the police. We led a march all through the area around Broadway. And finally, it got dark, and this caught us by surprise. We didn't know what to do next. So we rallied everybody. We had 1,000 people at this point. And we said, "Come back tomorrow. We're going to continue this struggle." Well, it was not November 21st, 1963, that this happened. So the next day was the assassination, and that put everything on hold because everybody was trying to figure out what was the significance of what had happened. Rosie Milk called me today to remind me of what happened in Buffalo. There was a meeting of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The committee that Oswald was supposed to have had a chapter of in New Orleans, scheduled for that night in Buffalo, where the leader of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was on a national tour, and that night he was going to speak in Buffalo. So, the assassination happened. They identify Oswald as a member of Fair Play for Cuba. The hall cancels the event. Everybody's wondering what's happening. will it unleash a reign of police terror against the left? They had to get the head of the Fair Play for Cuba back to New York immediately. They had to take him to the airport so he could go back. Rosemary gets a call on her phone. A voice on the other end says, "You're dead now." But she was familiar with the tricks of the FBI, which used to send anonymous letters to our members in Buffalo and other efforts they made to try and break our solidarity and will, which they didn't. So the comrades didn't panic. Since the meeting couldn't take place, she recalled, they all got together and they went out to a movie to chill out until there was some more news that they could know what the hell was happening. Just a little aside. We were the only party on the left at that time that really didn't succumb to panic. Really true. Instead, we analyzed what had happened and we tried to find ways to push back. And so when this attorney, Mark Lane, who was an independent, a progressive, he had actually been a member of the state legislature at one point in the 50s, led a big campaign against fallout shelters, which the cement companies and the other things were making big money off of under Rockefeller when he was governor. So he wrote, he was a maverick, but he was a progressive, and he wrote a brief for the defense. Some of the points that would have been raised in court had Oswald lived to go on trial. And our party contacted him and helped set up an independent investigation, the Citizens Committee of Inquiry. And I became the secretary of that committee. And no other parties took on this question at all. And the Warren Commission then got set up, and their purpose was to whitewash the assassination, to blame it on one person. He was supposed to be either a kook or a left-wing fanatic, or both. But the story didn't make sense. The full weight of the capitalist establishment was then thrown behind the commission, and of course the media all fell into line. As I said in my talk, our party had no particular love for Kennedy. He was a rich ruling class president who was hostile to Cuba and the liberation struggles. We were constantly exposing him in our press. He wasn't backing up the struggle against segregation in the South. Everything that was done, he should have done much more, or he didn't expect he would. It was the struggle that had to make him do it. But even though we knew all this about him, that didn't stop us from recognizing what had happened and who had a motive to destroy him. Right now, we know that Barack Obama is head of an imperialist government that threatens the oppressed countries of the world with its death-dealing military. A government that has bailed out the billionaires here at the expense of the working class. But we also know that some of those same racist billionaire reactionaries, they hate him, and they want to sabotage everything he does. They hate even more the masses who still have hopes in Obama. They hate him for lighting their hopes. We always take that into consideration when we give our opinions on him and his administration. So that's what I kind of wanted to say in summary about the Kennedy assassination. And the talk that I gave before was in our paper.